All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Janet Seymour. I'm the Director of Outreach at the Wisconsin Historical Society, and just want to start by thanking all of you for taking the time to meet with us today to learn more about the Wisconsin History Center and the progress and the exciting work ahead as we come together to plan and build a new Wisconsin History Center. We really appreciate your support and your feedback. This session today is meant to share key project updates, and it's a chance for you to hear from the leadership of the Wisconsin Historical Society. It's also a wonderful opportunity for you to share questions and feedback as we get into the Q&A portion of this meeting. We'll look forward to your comments and questions and feedback. But we're ready to get started. So throughout the presentation, if there's a question or a comment that you don't want to save to the end, please feel free to share that in the chat as well. So we'll get started. I'm here today with my wonderful colleagues and leadership of the Wisconsin Historical Society, Christian Overland, our Director and CEO, Angela Titus, Assistant Deputy Director and Chief Program Officer, and Nick Hoffman, Administrator of Museums and Historic Sites. So thank you for being here today. We're going to kick things off, and I'll pass it over to Christian Overland. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you, Janet, and welcome everybody. It's great to see some familiar faces like Janet said as well, and some names on the screen. So the first thing is that our guidepost, like many cultural organizations, is the mission to actually achieve this new history center. And I wanted to bring you to kind of two big words for us: connects and sharing. Those are the words that really motivate us, that change our organization continually. We're a learning organization. And the idea of being a learning organization is just not producing educational products, but ourselves learning better about public history, better about scholarship, better about collections, stewardship as well. So we think about connecting people to the past by collecting, preserving, and then sharing stories. And then stories is the other word that is just categorically huge for us. It is about not telling, but facilitating. It is about bringing communities together. It's about engaging each other, working with all 72 counties in Wisconsin, and then in our region as well. So our guidepost is the mission, as always, and you can see how it actively guides us through this process. So recent milestones, and we'll flip to the next slide. In 2018, we used the mission, especially with sharing and thinking about stories and facilitating that process through a process that we call the statewide engagement initiative. And the idea of that was to go out talking to various communities, all of our nations as well too, all the tribal nations that is, and thinking about how we can actually connect people's stories to this new initiative. The initiative has been going on for 20 years. But we came up with a newer version of it. And this is probably the fourth version the organization has gone through, but now it's a reality. And to really achieve that, we wanted to do something that really pulled people together on the idea of a history center being designed for the people, by the people. So this Share Your Stories and Share Your Voice series was actually initiated by Janet, who you met just a few minutes ago, to actually go around the state and do that. They actually put together a great report in 2020. That's on our website. You can find it underneath the new museum tab. And you can reports on all the outcomes and actually interesting tools that we've used, such as word maps, as well as our philosophy of how we actually use the methodology to construct this visitor study. But then again, moving forward in 2021, after that, we'll use that information to format what we call the vision and statement of purpose. And Angela Titus and Nick Hoffman, who you're going to meet in a few minutes, worked on that for the organization. In December of 2021, they pulled together our staff to talk about where we're going. And we initiated also voices from the outside from our industry, whether it was from museum studies programs directors, academic people, the Smithsonian colleagues that we have, again, visitor study experts, as well as Imagineers from Disney. to think about storytelling and help us frame some of this. So we created an operational readiness, if you will, to go forward. And that's the vision statement of purpose. Next slide, please. So how did we do that through the pandemic? Some of you may have heard about this project before when we were actually going to build on our site in a different way that we're building today. We were going to be part of a larger development with an office building and housing. So we decided to move away from that model because we felt we needed to create a standalone history center that would actually be here for the next 110, 150 years, and a better opportunity to serve people as well, and to really focus our money and energy on the history center rather than a part of being a development. So we started to move around the Capitol throughout the pandemic. Literally 4 different spots we moved around, investigating them, coming close on a couple. But we came back to our original spot in a different way because Mr. Mose, who owns the buildings next to us on Carroll, decided to sell them to us. And so we now have our own footprint back to the reality of building our own standalone history center. At the same time, we secured Ralph Applebaum and Associates, and we announced that last fall as far as who's going to be the design team for the interior of this museum and history center. So we're very happy with that. And the reason why is, and many of you I know on the screen have worked in the industry for a long time, Ralph and his team have done an amazing job at a variety of sites. And we should take a look at some of that work, such as the top is First Americans Museum in Oklahoma, recently opened up, and in Oklahoma City. And that was done by Ralph Applebaum and Associates, and really well done. It's still being surveyed and how it's working. So we're interesting to see how that thing rolls out. But it's very exciting of what they accomplished there, and how they did it is similar to some things that we want to do as well. And Ralph designed the exhibitions in the Smithsonian for the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Along with this architecture team that joined Ralph, the Smith Group, which is a Washington, D.C. based team. They're in Detroit as well as Chicago and Madison. They've designed a variety of Smithsonian museums before, and other state museums. So we hired them as well. And then most recently, and I should also add, we have a state architect team, Continuum Architects, that are working with us, and they worked on the Chazen Museum as well as some other cultural organizations. But moving forward from the winning of those contracts, we moved to the State Building Commission to get full approval of the architecture and design contracts. And the biggest approval is the ability to spend the money that we have, from the state, which is $70 million that the state gave us. And then we raised over 30 million already for the building. The building's going to be 100,000 square feet, and they released $4 million of that money to start the design immediately. So we are greenlit and we're going forward. The future milestones that we're looking at and going forward is our concept design. As I said, operational readiness is where we are today. So we're moving fairly fast in a concept design mode. Then we're going to hit that in October. So through that process, and this is the iterative piece that we're doing, starting this out, we're doing project updates, information sessions, and we'll continue to do that through the end of that process. And then we get to concept design and we move from that and say, we're all good. Then we go to schematic. That's where we really start working on the exhibit work, exhibitions, the movies, the films, the digital pieces as well too. And we start to move them from just thematic themes and maybe some sub-themes into storylines, and starting to pick the artifacts and experiences that we want to have. Design development takes it even further, especially with digital media starting to be produced and prototyped. We're going to do some iterative testing along the way to make sure that we're doing the job that we need to do for all of our residents. And then program development, everything from architecture program development about where the offices will be, where the exhibition areas, prep areas will be, as well as some of the storage areas for ongoing exhibitions, as well as curatorial places for people to work. And of course, programs for our public. So final design, and that's construction drawings, will hit in 2024. That's when we're expected to take down the building, and that's when construction begins. production in full force. So we move from 24 to 26 to opening day. Lots of things that will happen, and final tweaking of the exhibitions and final tweaking of lots of films and interactives. And the installation will be complete in the late fall of 2026. That's our schedule today, and opening in late fall of 2026. So I'm going to turn it back over to Janet, who's going to talk about the Share Your Voice program that we did, the outreach program, and she's going to connect with you some terrific numbers. Janet?
Thanks, Christian. We've just spent a few minutes learning about our future milestones for this project and looking forward to the opening of the History Center in 2026. But I just wanted to spend a few minutes looking back to 2018 and 2019 when the Society engaged in a statewide series of listening sessions. And I know that many of you who are attending today were hosts or participated in those sessions and were key partners for us in making that a successful statewide conversation. So we appreciate your past support and that you're still engaged in helping us with this project and building a new Wisconsin History Center. So in 2018 and 19, for about a year and a half, our teams worked with communities and regions across the state. In total, we had conversations with over 5,000 people. We designed a specific engagement series with Wisconsin's First Nations and had specific conversations with nations and with tribal communities. We also designed a special outreach effort with over 1,000 K-12 students and their teachers. And we're in about 55 different communities across the state in each region over the course of about a year. So we had a wonderful opportunity to really hear diverse voices and clear directives from communities in all 72 counties. And Kristen had put in the chat earlier the link to the statewide engagement report. I encourage you to check out the report. Some of you will see yourselves in it for those who attended sessions, but it's a wonderfully illustrated report with lots of photographs and word clouds and interesting data sets that reflect Wisconsin residents' vision for a new history museum that shares the stories of our state. You can go to the next slide. Just to share a couple of key takeaways here today. We heard consistently from communities across the state that it is imperative to represent the state's diversity and to share exhibitions and programs that do not shy away from difficult topics or contemporary issues that we're facing today. And so there was a clear direction to engage in programming and exhibits with relevant content. There was also a clear call for increased access across the state using technology to provide virtual programming for all ages. Of course, we had these conversations before the pandemic and before Zoom and all of the technology that does connect us now. So we're thinking about virtual programming in a very new way, having experienced that shift in programming and accessibility over the past couple of years. We also know that people are very interested in immersive and interactive exhibition design and storytelling. And while folks appreciate the accessibility and what technology offers in terms of virtual programming opportunities, we know that people have a strong desire to experience the Society's collections in person whenever possible in exhibitions and programming. Some key takeaways that we heard from people who participated in the tribal community sessions and meetings with tribal leadership. We know that Indigenous people continue to have significant concerns about history and culture and how that's represented in museums. Some of those specific concerns include access to cultural assets that are held within museum collections and how Native objects were collected by the museum. And we have continued to engage in conversations and listening sessions with tribal communities. Those are continuing this summer as well, to really work with community members to ensure that the stories and voices are centered in and appropriately contextualized throughout exhibits and programming. And so a real focus on sovereignty and language and identity in framing and sharing those stories. And this was a really fun part of the Share Your Voice series, was the visits to classrooms across the state and conversations with students and their teachers. We know that at the middle and high school level, there's a strong interest in storylines related to hunting and fishing and immigration and American Indian history. And like adults, kids also have a strong preference for those hands-on activities and experiences, in addition to digital content that can be delivered throughout the state. So another aspect that we began to hear from communities across the state was a focus on placing local and regional history within a national context. I think this quote from a 2019 listening session that we held in Eau Claire really illustrates how participants in listening sessions began to connect their specific personal or local story and placing Wisconsin history and experience in a larger national perspective. So that leads us back to Christian, where he'll share a little bit more about the framing for the new Wisconsin History Center.
Thank you, Janet. So as I mentioned previously, the statement of purpose and vision statement that we put together last year, this is the idea. The History Center will be a hub of inspiration, exploration that illuminates history with the purpose of inspiring people to build a better future. So what Janet just got to talking about in terms of like nesting Wisconsin's historical stories and their history in a framework that's enveloped in the national context is important to us because we can do it. We're a little bit different than other organizations, especially state history organizations, because of the massive and significant scale that we have in the North American history collections. Whether it's about social justice, innovation, entrepreneurship, agriculture, foodways, we have these collections here on the national scale to tell those stories. And so we're embarking on the idea where this is done a little bit differently than in other state museums that you may have seen in the past. This will be a place where people can find the larger context story of North America, whether it's 13,000 years ago, 13,000 years ago with American Indians and their storylines that have come through all these years, or whether it's recent immigration or migration into Wisconsin or into the United States. These are the stories that we're able to tell because we've been documenting them since 1848 and continue to do that and continue to facilitate those sharing of stories. So how are we doing it? The idea is that we have three pillars for the center. And the center idea, and this is what's so important, it's more than a museum. It is a construct where there can be dialogue and debates. It's a place of facilitation. It's a place where people can meet. It's a place where people can bring their stories, whether they're films, whether they're video, whether there's National History Day contests going on, whether a community wants to tell their story in the context of the State History Center. We can do that and we will do that. So we're stretching ourselves rather than just calling it a museum. That's the idea behind a history center. The three pillars that we're using to do that are, one, a center of American history. And the idea of that is that we've been collecting American history since 1846. It's actually in our statutes. Not many people know that, but we have that. And it's a big strength for the society. 2, flagship for the society. And it's a flagship venue, right? More than just one of our 12 historic sites, but how do we connect through the entire society? 3, community engagement and how we do that well, again, facilitating and sharing stories. Now I'm going to turn it over to Nick Hoffman and then later Angela Titus, who are the people that are working on building our nation's next great history center. Nick?
Thanks, Christian. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into each of these pillars. And as Christian mentioned, these are our guideposts for the development of the new History Center as we're starting to think about things like themes, programming, PK through 12 activities in museum, community engagement. All of those things really need to connect back to these 3 pillars. So we know that we're hitting our mark, and that also that we're doing our best work for the state of Wisconsin and the nation. So our first big pillar, the Center for American History, has some really big objectives. One is putting Wisconsin's history in an American and global context. A great example of that, as Christian spoke to earlier, is thinking beyond our Wisconsin borders. Hmong immigration, for instance, how do we tell that full global story and the full global story of 20th century immigration in this new museum? That's not something that's defined by the state alone, but in a much broader, larger context. So thinking about how things connect back to Wisconsin and how national, international events play out every single day, every moment in our state is really central to what we're developing. We also, as Christian mentioned, have a dynamic collection. And in its enormity, there are so many wonderful pieces that connect back to this American experience. We really are positioned as an agency to tell this story in such a strong and dynamic way. So bringing forward some of the collections that I think a lot of people may not be as accustomed to. A lot of researchers working on their PhD, working on books, so frequently rely on our library and archives to do that work on a wide variety of national, international, and state history. So we won't just be bringing forward collections and stories told through our 3-dimensional collection, even though those will be very apparent in the museum, but thinking beyond that, thinking to our film collections, to our library and archive collections. They are so vast and have so many rich stories to help tell this great perspective. We're also going to be developing interpretive themes that resonate with people across the state and nation. So again, bringing more relevance to people in our neighboring states, visitors to Madison, visitors to Wisconsin, making us a destination for people who are visiting our state and are looking for a little more context. And then also really bringing forward a narrative of tradition, innovation, struggle, and triumph. And that's really critical for us because we want to make sure that the new museum really ties to all of the emotions that an individual we would hope would experience going through a museum. So mapping out that emotional journey that's not just about celebrating history, although that's definitely going to be very apparent, but actually getting to the roots of those celebrations. Because with every celebratory moment, there were a lot of starts and stops. There are movements backwards, movements forward. So just really thinking about how all of those emotions play into the museum. We're hoping that people may cry, they may laugh, and also build empathy through all of these accomplishments in the state and nation. But there are just so many opportunities. Going back to our collection, thinking about the role of media and international politics and cultural movements that can be told so well through our vast newspaper collection. That's both state, national, and even international newspapers. Again, thinking about our collections in some different ways for developing experiences. And then even going to it in a larger lens, thinking about the American civil rights movement, social justice movements, which again, our collection is so well positioned to tell that national story, but then bring it back to a layer that a lot of people just might not expect. The way that Wisconsin contributed to the national movement, or even how the civil rights movement played out in every single corner of the state of Wisconsin. So we can really tell these wonderful stories that connect all of our places to the state, to those big national and even international themes. Next slide. We also, of course, are developing a museum that's going to be the flagship venue for the society. This new museum is going to be a really big driver for all of our activities, all of our interactions across the state. This is going to be one of our big connecting points with all of our affiliates that we work with across Wisconsin. It's also about really positioning the agency to take our programming to the next level. So we've got some great examples of that. Obviously, the new museum, compared to the current museum and just its current size and capabilities of a facility of that size and age, we're going to be able to now bring forward unparalleled access to collections and resources. And we're thinking about that in a lot of different ways. For one, visitors to modern museums are looking for, ways to learn new things every visit. They're looking for opportunities to see different aspects of the collection. And so part of our strategy is building about 10,000 square feet into the new museum that can be broken up into different compartments, maybe 3 sections, but that allows us to bring in major blockbuster exhibits that might be able to bring in both internationally and nationally. It also allows us to bring out more aspects of our collection so we can continue to share different stories with partners across the entire state. We're also looking, obviously, for a compelling guest experience. So again, trying to really make the stories of the state and the people who live in the state as the driver of that compelling guest experience. We want the museum to, of course, be an experience that stands out from other similar museums across the entire state. We think that we can be very cutting edge. And so developing experiences that are meaningful and memorable and stand out in people's memories and want to come back. We also want the new History Center to spark debate, dialogue, and understanding. And we're trying to think of ways now about how that happens. How do we facilitate those conversations? How do we use history and history relevance as ways to use the past to inform decision-making in the present and also in the future? So we want this space to be an area that inspires people, again, to think about a better future and walk away from the museum with some calls to action about what the future they envision, how does it become a reality? As I already mentioned, we'll certainly be bringing in blockbuster exhibits. We'll have changing galleries, perhaps some changing sections within some of our core galleries in the museum. And then also large public events of all varieties of scales and sizes, but again, really unique opportunities that people will really want to be a part of at the new History Center. And then also, as Janet mentioned, some of our direct feedback was trying to find ways that the History Center can connect across the entire state. And one of the ways we want to do that is by developing a digital network of programming that connects to Wisconsin and beyond, and thinking about reciprocity. So in one aspect, that is certainly going to be allowing people to participate in programs across the state through virtual programming that's hosted at the museum. But that also means taking that on the road. We could be doing programming at our affiliate locations, partner organizations, and using our platform to share their programming as well. So it's a different way of sort of approaching what a digital network might look like from the museum, but really democratizing history and bringing more people into the History Center to share their stories again. Next slide. And then we also are viewing this museum as a center for community engagement. And that's going to be something that we're really going to be developing. It's going to look a little bit different when we get to the new History Center, but we're starting to already practice that. One of the things that Angela will mention is talking about our transition across the entire state while we move from the current History Center into the new History Center, and how that gap of a few years is really going to provide us an opportunity to really rethink how we work with communities in sharing their history, both in exhibits, programming, and other forms of engagement. So the Center for Community Engagement is going to really be a place, again, where the state can come together and talk about their history and make it relevant into the present. So we're looking for different ways to make really meaningful access for exhibits, programs, and all functions. We have a commitment to inclusion, representation, and meaningful engagement. Certainly in Wisconsin history and national history, every single thing we do, we need to be thinking about ways of history that's been marginalized as part of those stories, or ways to just completely widen history and tell a much fuller history. So bringing in more voices into those conversations is really going to help us bring and live forward that community engagement framework. We're going to, again, have an inclusive and whole history of Wisconsin and the American experience through all of our programming, really centering the voices and perspectives of diverse communities across the entire state, as well as rural and urban voices. spotlight personal stories and provide opportunities for interaction. So not just sharing history one way through like a lecture, but finding more ways where we're bringing in artists and demonstrators to share what they do and make those personal interactions with our visitors. And then also continue to forge a network of community partners, continuing to find ways to strengthen and enhance our affiliate program, but then also start to expand our partnerships to different organizations, tribal nations across the entire state, and really think about ways we can work together. So this really brings forward a museum that isn't just 9 to 5. This is going to be a living, breathing, dynamic space with daytime and nighttime programming. And Angela will talk a little bit more about what that might look like in practice.
Thanks, Nick. So Nick did a great job of describing the fundamental pillars that we're using to build this history center. What does that look like in practice? So there will be this expansion of temporary space. Our current museum on the square has a lot of permanent exhibits, and we do some temporary exhibits, but this will allow us to be much more flexible in terms of the changing exhibits that come in and out, what size those are, the frequency with which we stage those. And it allows us to then be able to tell many more stories. So if we're not changing exhibits as frequently, it limits the number of stories that we can tell. And you've heard Christian and Nick both talking about just the rich collection that we can draw from. And we want to make sure that everybody feels like their story is being told at some point in this museum, and they see themselves every time they come to visit us. And Nick talked about how active we want this space to be. We really want to see dynamic public programs day and evening. And so this could be talks or tours and other programming throughout the day. But then in the evening, that demo kitchen, we could be having foodways history. We could have chefs' dinners happening at night. We could have, VIP events in the evening, rentable spaces that the community members are using to celebrate, whether it's a wedding or a quinceanera. We want people to really feel like this is their place. So lots of active programming going on. It's not just for students. And the spaces that the community members can use can be spaces that we're having civic discourse, they're learning something. It's really a welcoming space. So both from an architectural perspective, as well as the programming going on inside the building, really want it to be warm and welcoming and inclusive. There might be quiet spaces for those who have special needs like autism, for example, or potentially a mom just needs a quiet place to nurse, or a senior might need a quiet space. So making sure we're building those sorts of thoughtful access points for people. And really, it could just be a place people can drop in. They could shop over the holiday. They might just want to pop in and have a coffee. We really want it to feel like their place and have people feel like they can flow in and out of the space at any time. Nick talked about the statewide hub for programming and that reciprocal programming model. And definitely the idea is to really take advantage of the fact that there are over 400 local history affiliates across the state who are doing wonderful programming. How can we share that with communities other than where they are located? So we could be a hub for really sharing this content across the state and the region, frankly, as well as having programs happening at the center that are getting pushed out to anyone who's in the virtual space. And then another thing we'll have a great opportunity to do is really have these pop-up spaces across the state. So when our current museum is closed and we're building this new history center, how do we continue to serve the public? How do we stay active? How do we continue to share stories and history, sharing our collection? And so we're building out a way for us to be in both rural communities and urban communities, and really just continue to be visible and do our best to serve the public while we are building this wonderful new building. So on the next slides, there are a couple of specific examples of how this new history center will do programming. So you see an example here from Madeline Island, where we currently have an exhibit that was installed, and it's by a professional artist, Rabbit Before Horses Strickland. So what we did is also invited community participation from young people in Wisconsin and neighboring states to stage their own exhibits. So you see these wonderful examples here, these proud faces showing off their beadwork. And so these young people were able to share their Ojibwe cultural traditions as a complement to the work of the professional artists. And there was an event where families and community members were invited to come in, and it really is allowing the community to tell their own stories. It doesn't always have to be us telling these stories. On the next slide is an example of what the virtual space will look like. So we do see ourselves as this hub. And how do we have a really robust website? So even before you come to the museum, or God forbid that you don't ever come to the museum, but if you're just unable to visit frequently, we want you to be able to go online and participate in a way that's really robust. So there's webinars, there's potentially live streaming. Our wonderful archaeologists you see here diving on shipwrecks. Maybe there's a talk or you know, a live stream where people can ask questions. How do we really connect with folks who, because of maybe transportation concerns, or they're simply in a rural area or just can't get to the History Center, that they will be able to visit us online and really view, but also actively participate in public programs. So that's the vision of how we sort of operationalize those three pillars. So just a couple of examples, and we're building out over the next few years many more, and we'll be prototyping and testing a lot of these, hopefully in partnership with some of you. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Christian.
Thanks, Angela. So what we're doing right now, sharing this with you is, you know, hopefully you have some questions or you've been pondering, or you have some comments, because we'd love to hear from you. That's really the purpose of this, and especially with some of our colleagues on here, as well as the general public. This is a process that we're in that's invested into working with collaboration. So I'm going to open it up, because you've heard from our great team leaders that we have here. Now we want to hear from you.